Thank you, David. When I was walking in here, I asked Lionel how many people are here. He said, well, there are about 250. And I said, are they all serious? He said, yeah, when he last looked, they look serious. So I can see that you all look very serious, but also joyful. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity of speaking at this FT Africa Summit. Your theme is on innovation. I'll touch a little bit on innovation, but I'll leave that to the speakers who are going to come after me. I want to talk more broadly about what Africa is about. And over the years, this summit has really been built and has a reputation of attracting the number of people who are here, who are serious about Africa, who see the dynamism that Africa currently represents. And we value your participation here as investors, as financiers, as well as developmental partners of the African continent. So this I see as a wonderful platform for African leaders, and there are quite a number of them here. And it's, for me, a real joy to be in the presence of former President of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who I told that she's looking younger and younger. And she's always been very beautiful, but much more beautiful. And she makes the hearts of younger men like me flutter a little bit. Now, many of us who've been watching developments on the African continent over the recent years would have seen the emergence of a common vision, a common and new vision on the African continent, a vision for peace, for growth and development. Now, the continent itself has undergone profound changes since the formation of the African Union, Organization of African Unity in 1963, and even ever since the African Union was formed in 2002. Our founding fathers, the founding fathers of the OAU, had obviously to fight lots of struggles to end colonialism and to establish nation states. But this time around, the recent generation of leaders have been forging a very ambitious program to fundamentally transform Africa's fortunes. And this program of change, of fundamental transformation, is outlined in the AU's Agenda 2063, which envisages a continent that is at peace with itself, that is stable, but a continent that is also well-governed, and a continent where its substantial resources, both natural and human, are used to benefit all the people of the various countries on our continent, and not just a few, the elite few. In pursuance of achieving these bold objectives of changing our continent, there are new imaginative initiatives that have been embarked upon, and the types that would have made Pliny the Elder of the Roman times to observe that indeed there is something new always out of Africa. This could not have been more true than what we observed recently when the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Prime Minister Ahmed Abiy of Ethiopia. Now, this came out of the blue, and we were all overjoyed as Africans. And this award is a worthy recognition of the work that Prime Minister Abiy is forging in East Africa. But this award is much bigger than that. It is a major boost for the project of silencing the guns on the African continent and installing peace that will enable us as a continent to achieve our bold ambitions. This new generation of leaders of Ahmed Abiy's ilk are bold, they are courageous, and are focused on creating an Africa that is not only at peace with itself, but an Africa that wants to push the boundaries of innovation, make sure that there's infrastructure on our continent, and develop trade and grow the economies of our continent. Their interest, these leaders, extends beyond the boundaries or the borders of their own countries to promoting greater economic development within the respective economic regions on the African continent. Now, as we pursue economic integration, these regions are taking even greater significance. I can think of the East African community, for example, which is far more advanced in many respects as it has committed itself to gradually establishing a customs union, a common market, a monetary union even, and ultimately a political federation of East African states. This is a continent that, despite its challenges of being a young continent, is a dynamic one and has vast potential and has great promise. The message we bring here today is that Africa is ready for the great leapfrog on many fronts, including attracting investment, displaying its innovative talent, as well as its capability, and catapulting itself to higher levels of human development. Africa indeed is ready to partner with investors, the private sector, and many other developmental agencies around the world, because it's been proven many times over and in numerous countries on the African continent that those discerning investors who spend time to look more closely at Africa have been able to make good money from Africa through their investments. We have reached a moment, I think, in our history as Africa, where Africa needs more investments, much more than it needs foreign aid. This year's summit comes as we begin the countdown to the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area. This has been a phenomenal milestone by the leaders of Africa, because this free trade area agreement will bring together into a single market 54 nations of some 1.2 billion people and perhaps a combined GDP of over $3 trillion. Just as the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 represented a new era of African cooperation and integration, the African Continental Free Trade Area is the realization of the dream of the founders of the Organization of African Unity 56 years ago. And what we've been doing is to learn from what others have done in the past, and also look at the mistakes that they've made and the mistakes that they continue to make as they move on, as they try to undo the European Union and a few others. We want to learn from what they are doing and what they are not doing correctly. And I can promise you that our union will be much more durable than what we can see around. As we meet here to discuss the potential for scaling up investment and trade with and within the African continent, we do so with an appreciation that we are on the cusp, and indeed the cusp of a new era on the African continent. We share a common vision to see greater levels of investment directed into Africa and see greater and higher volumes of intra-African trade. Trade amongst African countries is currently at 15%, compared to 47% in the Americas, 61% in Asia, and 67% in Europe. By some estimates, the new free trade area could increase the value of trade within Africa by 15% to 25% by 2040. In addition to its economic impact, the African Continental Free Trade Area will have far-reaching political, social, and physical and international effects. On the economic front, it will improve access to existing markets and lead to the creation of new ones. The free flow of goods and services will enable African businesses and entrepreneurs to expand their own horizons. It will lead to the creation of a huge number of businesses, both big and small. And I see the small, medium enterprises just burgeoning and growing by leaps and bounds, as their owners and their operators will now know that the African market is their full market. This treaty will unleash the manufacturing and industrial capability of the continent, as companies will now seek to make products for this burgeoning African market. The removal of trade barriers will lower prices and benefit consumers throughout the continent. Business costs will also be reduced, and business efficiency will also be raised. The innovative talent that resides in the minds and the hearts of the young people on our continent will surge to the fore. And I can tell you that we've got a lot of innovative young people on the African continent. African governments are hard at work putting together regulations and mechanisms in place to ensure that this free trade area is a success. And it's a joy to go to the African Union meetings, where we talk less about politics and much more about the economy and about trade. And it's a great joy to watch African presidents and prime ministers, even in informal talk, talking more about how can we open trade routes, how can we continue trading more and more with each other, and how can we grow our economies. This, for me, is just a breath of fresh air, because in the past it used to be much more about politics, but now it's about growing economies and increasing trade. Now, these measures and initiatives include having good regulations on easing customs controls, developing regulations on the cross-border movement of people, reforming taxation and intellectual property regimes, and improving anti-corruption legislation. On the political front, this free trade area agreement will help to consolidate the union amongst all African states. It will, in my view, reduce the potential for conflict, because there is no benefit in waging wars and having strife with countries that you trade with. So this will be the good derivative that we will gain out of this free trade area agreement. From a social perspective, it is likely to result in more cosmopolitan Africa, as the greater movement of people and skills brings more people of diverse backgrounds and talent and nationalities together. As African countries become more connected to each other through highways and railways, through regional power grids and water infrastructure, the continent itself will undergo a huge infrastructural transformation. The borders drawn up in the palaces of Europe will gradually become less significant than the infrastructure matrix that will link African economies together. Now, this free trade area agreement will also have a broader international impact, as Africa will be able to deal with other trading blocs around the world from a position of strength and from a position of displaying its huge economies of scale as a market. As the incoming chair of the African Union next year, South Africa will be putting great emphasis on giving effect to the agreement on the Continental Free Trade Area, and also on consolidating the peace that is emerging and spreading throughout the continent. In the end, there is much work that needs to be done and many obstacles that need to be overcome, but we are determined that Africa should seize this moment. This is a historic moment for our continent, and already we are demonstrating our capability of seizing the day and this great moment. Now, the convergence of economies and the integration of the markets under this agreement will make the case for investing on the African continent even stronger, not only because it is a continent with abundant natural resources and arable land, water, wind, and sunshine to drive the renewable energy revolution, but because Africa is the continent with the youngest population in the world. It is also a rapidly urbanizing continent. By 2030, Africa will have more than 41 mega cities with more than 10 million inhabitants each. This growth in urban populations is contributing to raise standards of living and rising affluence on the African continent. Africa in the end, and we can see the emergence thereof, is becoming a much more sophisticated consumer market with increasing spending power and increased demand for products and services. And you not only see it in the young people, the way they choose their cell phones, the way they dress, you actually see it in the older people as well, as they are becoming much more discerning, waiting for modern products to be sold to them. Over the last 2 decades, Africa has become more stable as democracy has spread throughout the continent. This year alone, elections will have been held in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Malawi, Mauritania, and now in Tunisia. This week, there will be elections in Mozambique, and later in the year in Ghana and Cameroon, Botswana, Namibia, and Nigeria. These aren't just political milestones for the respective countries. They are a signal of growing political stability that we would like the world to recognize on the African continent. National elections on the continent have become the norm rather than the exception. Across Africa, countries are enacting reforms to improve business confidence. Public institutions are being set up and they are being reformed, and laws to fight corruption and bribery are being strengthened. Because of these cumulative reforms, 5 of the 10 most improved countries in this year's World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index are from the African continent. This should bolster and increase investor confidence by leaps and bounds. Between 2017 and 2018, global direct foreign investment to Africa rose by 11% at a time when global FDI flows fell by 13%. Now, according to the IMF, of the world's 10 fastest growing economies, 6 of them are in Africa. These countries are industrializing, they are diversifying, and attracting new investment on an ongoing basis. The economies are becoming increasingly sophisticated as investors seek returns in industries from renewable energy to ICT and telecoms to agribusiness. And this is also underpinned by the growth of innovation on the African continent. This is not made light of our challenges. This is not to make light of our challenges. We still have enormous challenges as a continent, but the good thing now is that we are confronting those challenges. African leaders are not sitting back and just being bowled over by the challenges. We continuously deal with these challenges, and the challenges are quite enormous. They're unemployment, especially among young people. Poverty is still widespread and inequality continues to grow. Millions do not have access to proper health care or decent education. The IMF estimates that Africa needs to create 20 million jobs a year over the next 2 decades. The average debt to GDP ratio on the continent has risen to 57%, with debt servicing costs increasing quite sharply. Policy and regulatory uncertainty, weak implementation, and corruption still tends to deter investors, much as many countries on the continent are trying to curb the scourge of corruption in their own countries. These are challenges we recognize, and we're doing everything in many of the African countries to curb and to eliminate these challenges. Like many other countries on the continent, South Africa is positioning itself as an investment destination of choice. And at the core of the efforts that we are making is to ensure that we entrench good governance and we grow enhancing reforms. We have growth enhancing reforms and also consolidate the macroeconomic stability of our country. As a country, we have vast mineral resources, as we all know, and we have the third largest coastline in Africa. We have world-class infrastructure, a sophisticated and well-regulated banking and financial services sector. We also are proud of the independence of many of our institutions, including our judiciary, and we also have a very independent revenue service, a diverse manufacturing base, and an able workforce. Now, since last year, we've been implementing key structural reforms to address perennial weak growth that our country has suffered from over a number of years. We've also been embarking on a number of measures to ignite economic activity, to also restore investor confidence and to create jobs in our country. Now, we have taken steps to provide greater policy certainty in a number of areas, such as mining, oil and gas, and telecoms, as part of the efforts to create a much more stable environment for growth. Right now, we are finalizing our energy roadmap, which we call the Integrated Resource Plan, which includes a diversified portfolio of technologies, including more efficient and lower emissions coal technologies. We're also looking at what role nuclear can play, hydropower, gas, renewables, and battery storage. We have initiated the release of the high-demand broadband spectrum, which will bring down data costs and encourage investment. As part of attracting skilled professionals and growing the tourism that we so need in our country, we have prioritized immigration reform and changes to the visa regime. And this is a result of a number of those people who are well disposed to our country who have informed us that our visa regime is archaic and it prevents many people from coming to our country as business people, as professionals, as academics, and also as tourists. We're undertaking a process of accelerated land reform guided by the recommendations of an expert panel that I appointed. This panel has presented a comprehensive package of measures to resolve what is not only one of the greatest injustices of our colonial and apartheid history, but also an impediment to faster and much more inclusive growth. We are undertaking this work in line with the precepts of our Constitution, committed not only to safeguard property rights, but also to ensure that our people have an equal opportunity to exercise those rights. We are keen to take advantage of the appetite for diversification amongst investors. We are therefore developing plans for industries with high growth potential, such as the automotive sector in our country, the clothing and textile sector, the gas and chemicals and plastic sector. The renewable energy sector is one sector where we have demonstrated enormous innovative growth. We're also looking at how we can exploit the economies that are given by the oceans, agriculture, and high-tech industries as well. Our focus is on expanding trade and investment links with the rest of the Southern African region and the continent as a whole. Now, as the largest manufacturing economy in sub-Saharan Africa, the Free Trade Area Agreement presents immense opportunities for South Africa. For example, we are the largest exporter of trucks to the rest of the African continent and the fourth largest exporter of cars. Exports to other African countries directly support about 250,000 jobs in our country. We are also strengthening trade links with other regions of the world. Most recently, South Africa and the 5 other countries in Southern African region concluded a new trade agreement with the United Kingdom in the event that there is a no-deal Brexit. In that regard, we've been proactive to anticipate that there may be no favorable exit and which would have a negative impact on us. So we've reached an agreement with the UK. The new agreement will effectively replicate the terms of trade present in the existing SADC and EU Economic Partnership Agreement in respect of tariffs, quotas, rules of origin, and health and safety regulations. Now, for us, this is an important agreement because it is also important for thousands of South African workers whose jobs are dependent on bilateral trade with Britain, and for the investors who utilized our country as an export base to the UK and the rest of the world. In less than a month, we will host the second South Africa Investment Conference as part of our national drive to attract $100 billion in new investment over a 5-year period. Now, the inaugural conference that we held last year raised $20 billion in investment commitments, and some of those investment commitments have already been realized. Our focus at this year's conference will be on moving beyond commitments to bankable projects that are ready to be implemented. It is through building social compacts amongst all partners, government, labor, business, and civil society, that we will be able to overcome our economic and social challenges. I have been holding monthly meetings with leaders of business, labor, and community organizations on detailed measures to address the unemployment crisis in our country. And through these meetings, we are scaling up on initiatives that are aimed at promoting job creation, but much more importantly, on scaling up on youth employment and also consolidating and developing small business development. South Africa recognizes that to grow our economy and to create jobs and support investments, we have to pursue prudent fiscal policies coupled with sound macroeconomic management. At a time when our fiscus is under great pressure, we are committed to ensuring debt stabilization, improving the composition of spending, and reducing risks arising from contingent liabilities, especially with regard to our state-owned enterprises. Now, one of the greatest challenges that many of you will know that our economy faces is the dire state of our electricity utility, Eskom, which has accumulated a huge debt and which has severe liquidity problems and extensive operational challenges. We have embarked on a process to strengthen governance at our state electricity company. We've also embarked on a process to cut costs, to improve debt collection and increase energy availability and plant performance. This is part of a longer-term plan for the company that will see it unbundled into 3 entities responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution. And in this regard, we are moving in the same direction that many other countries have moved in, to unbundle it and to get the various divisions of the company to focus on what they are best at. By acknowledging and confronting, as well as addressing these challenges, we are certain that South Africa will be well positioned to take full advantage of the many opportunities on the African continent. We are a continent of entrepreneurs, which is a critical ingredient in fostering growth on the African continent. African governments and companies and citizens are embracing innovation. They're also embracing new technologies to overcome the developmental constraints that Africa has long labored under. One need only look at the exponential growth of mobile technologies, such as mobile money transactions, since M-Pesa entered the East African market over a decade ago. 21% of adults in sub-Saharan Africa now have a mobile money account, the highest of any region in the world. In Ethiopia, drones are being used to deliver medication and even blood supplies to remote areas of the country. Across cities in Nigeria, solar-powered phone charging kiosks have become a familiar sight. But Africans aren't just consumers of technology. They are also inventors. They are adapting and customizing technology for the needs of our people. And Africa's needs for infrastructure is a major investment opportunity as we strive to meet our industrialization goals. On the infrastructure front, we need many more dams, power plants, fiber optic cables, and restructured ports. We also need more social infrastructure like roads, schools, public housing, and clinics. Now, the African Development Bank estimates that Africa's infrastructure needs amount to $130 billion to $170 billion a year. This need will not be met without significant private funding. For its part, South Africa is in the process of setting up an infrastructure fund, which I spoke about last year, to leverage investments from financial institutions, multilateral development agencies, asset managers, and commercial banks as well. Now, with the global move towards cleaner energy sources, Africa is perfectly situated for investment in wind, solar, bioenergy, hydro, and natural gas. South Africa's Renewable Energy Independent Producer Program, for example, has attracted approximately $14 billion in private sector investment in 102 projects, which have created 40,000 jobs in our country. And Africa's success lies in collaboration, in cooperation, and in partnership for mutual benefit. And it is in this area where we seek to see more and more collaboration. It also depends on Africa's countries working to advance the interests of their people, seeking African solutions for African problems. As we face this new era of African transformation and development, Africa wants to deal with the rest of the world on its own terms. Africa no longer wants terms to be imposed on it. It now wants to be a driver of its own destiny. It wants to see an end to outside interference, particularly from those countries that continue to fuel conflict on the African continent. The continent cannot develop fully for as long as parts of Africa remain theaters of war to advance the interests of powers far beyond our own borders. Foreign money that buys the weapons that are used in theaters of war on the African continent should instead be used to build bridges, ports, rail lines, schools, and hospitals and clinics. As governments, we are committed to create the necessary enabling environment for business to flourish and to succeed in Africa. And I call on the investment community to harness the climate of reform that is sweeping throughout the African continent. And I call upon them to look very closely and take advantage of this momentum that has been unleashed on the African continent for reform, for peace, and for fostering investment. There has never been a better time to invest in Africa. As the continent grows and develops, the benefits will continue to be reaped in years and decades to come. As African nations, there's never been a better time to deepen our collaboration to ensure that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, our most ambitious and collective venture, yet is a success. As Kwame Nkrumah famously said, "Divided we are weak, united, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world." We are at that moment where Africa, in what it does in transforming itself, can be a real force for good for the whole world. This is an opportunity to grow our economies, but also to use our considerable collective resources to uplift our people and to improve their contribution to the development of humanity. We may come from different parts of the world, we may speak different languages and have different cultures, but our fortunes as African nations are intertwined. Our destinies do intersect, and ultimately our success story will be a shared one of a united Africa, an Africa that has embraced transformation, and an Africa that is willing to develop economically, but partnered by the rest of the world as investors who are interested in the success of Africa. This is the Africa I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, thank you very much, both for giving the address and for coming to London. Your place is cemented in history as one of the key figures in bringing to an end peacefully apartheid in South Africa. But 25 years on, I think everyone in this room has some sense of the enormous challenges facing your country, restoring the power and authority of the state after a lost decade, rooting out endemic corruption and turning around what ought to be one of the most powerful economies on the continent. You, by nature, are cautious, a practitioner perhaps of strategic patience. But my question is, how long have you got?
I guess not long.
6 minutes.
No, we have been making progress, and we've made tremendous progress, obviously in the last 25 years, but in the last year and a few months, we've made tremendous progress in turning our country around and stabilizing institutions that were weakened over the past few years, and some of which were almost destroyed. We've re-established those institutions, strengthened them. For instance, institutions such as the revenue collection institutions, the tax collection institution was weakened quite enormously. We've repositioned it, and it is now going to continue on the good path. The prosecuting authority was also weakened over the past few years, and a number of other institutions, criminal intelligence and what have you. So we're strengthening those institutions, and they are now becoming more and more confident and more poised to execute their role and their task as independent institutions that are meant to restore governance in our country. So that has taken time, and we are now poised to move forward. And on the economic front, we have faced enormous weaknesses, some of which emanate from our apartheid past, but we're making progress, particularly on the reform agenda that we have embarked on, where there was a number of weaknesses, policy uncertainty, and inconsistency. We are addressing that. And I'm glad to see that we are doing that in tandem with what many other countries on the continent are also doing.
So next month, Moody's is going to deliver a verdict on whether South Africa will still maintain its investment grade on its debt. What can you tell us today, particularly regarding your plans for reforming Eskom, which is going to reassure Moody's and keep that investment grade?
Well, Eskom, as I was saying, is dogged by its huge debt. We're going to be making announcements of how we're going to deal with that debt in a few days. And we hope that Moody's will take note of what we are seeking to do. And we're coming up with a number of ideas, innovative ideas of how to deal with the debt in Eskom. But we also have to deal with the issues of the executive management in Eskom. We will be making announcements in that regard. Lots of new appointments? Yes. From outside? Lots of new appointments, indeed. We will be focusing on that. We're also going to strengthen the board of Eskom. But we're also going to be dealing with just the debt collection, because the debt collection in terms of collecting the tariffs that people pay has weakened over time, and we're going to come up with new strategies and programs to deal with that. And I think that Moody's and others will be very happy with the announcements that we are going to make, and the announcements will be much broader than that. We will also be dealing with our strategy more broadly on energy, how we are going to be dealing with the energy mix that we have, because as you know, there's a lot of pressure on countries that rely on coal-fired power stations. We're also going to deal with that and give a clearer picture of where we will be moving forward with other sources of energy.
And everybody in this room is excited to hear your plans for South Africa Airways.
Well, South African Airways is one of those state-owned enterprises that has relied on lots of bailouts. And we are on record as saying we're open to participation of the private sector with regards to some of our SOEs. That has now gone throughout the country and it's sunk in. So SAA, for instance, we could be open to a strategic equity partner. And in fact, as we speak now, we're talking to a few interested parties when it comes to SAA, for instance.
Mr. President, you were a witness to the Truth and Reconciliation hearings more than 20 years ago. Can we expect Chapter 2 when the Guptas are extradited to South Africa?
Well, we've been working on how those who are complicit in the widespread corruption can be brought to book. We are committed through our various agencies, our prosecutorial authorities, our crime intelligence authorities, to make sure that those who are complicit, and let me immediately say, by the way, that our country has been dogged with a lot of corruption right across the board, in the private sector as well as in the public sector. There have been enormous scandals in the private sector where those who are responsible still have to be brought to book as well.
You're not talking about a certain retailer, are you?
Well, that and many others. So that is a process that is underway. Now, I'm more confident than I've been in the past that our prosecuting agency in putting together everything that they need to do, will definitely be going after those who are complicit in criminal activity. Be they in the country or be they outside the country, they will follow them up.
And do you think obviously everyone is innocent till proven guilty, especially in a South African court, but the scale of corruption was epic in the last 10 years, wasn't it?
It was huge. It was much bigger than I think many people could ever have imagined. But the good thing is that we have stemmed that bleeding. We are now ready to open a new chapter, and that new chapter is going to be those who are responsible will be brought to book,
yes.
And we now chart a new course of clean governance, of making sure that we avoid these corrupt tendencies.
Now, because we're in this room amongst friends, Mr. President.
Are we all friends here?
And some very good-looking friends, too.
Of course, of course.
But as you know, and we've known each other for nearly 20 years, I'm a numbers man. If you had to put a number on the cost of state capture and the amount of money that was just stolen, would you say it was about 500 billion rand?
It could easily be even above that.
My goodness.
It could even be above that. A lot of money was siphoned out of the coffers of the state through corrupt means, and some of those were very sophisticated. And may I say that some of those included blue chip companies of great world reputations, and they participated and abetted and aided the siphoning of money. And that is the shocking part, that companies that operate in various capitals of the world found their way into coming to steal money and siphon money out of a developing country that we are as South Africa. And it runs way beyond, in my view, more than 500 billion. Some people have even suggested that it could even be R1 trillion.
My goodness. Mr. President, I'm conscious of time, and I could happily sit here all morning talking to you.
I know that. And I wish I could come to a moment one day when I would ask you questions.
Just one last question, because I mentioned your role more than 25 years ago. It was significant. And there is this second chapter, if you like, waiting to be written. And many people said, both privately and publicly, when you became president, that you were South Africa's last best hope. I mean, how does it feel to carry that burden?
It's a scary notion. But fortunately, I'm not alone in all this. I have a huge number of people who are like-minded, who want to see our country being restored to a country that promotes and has embraced the values that Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and many other leaders stood for. So I'm aided and abetted by many, but it's not only in party circles, it's also in the private sector, it's also in the religious organizations. So there's an army of South Africans who want South Africa to do good, who want South Africa to go back to embracing and practicing those values that Nelson Mandela stood for. So in that regard, I stand on the shoulders of many South Africans as I work with others to lead our country down the good path.
I'm sure I speak for everybody in this room who wishes you the greatest success with the challenge.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You want me to go and sit down? Thank you, Lana.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer all questions in Pretoria.